Hey everybody, it's Tuesday and Yom Kippur begins at sundown tonight, I think. Anyway, it's been that kind of week already. But so I will not be streaming tonight on Twitch. I will be doing it tomorrow night instead, Wednesday. Not sure how that's going to go. I'm going to go kind of hour by hour with the fasting thing because I've been having real issues lately, health wise, notably stomach wise. But I will be streaming on Wednesday this week instead of Tuesday night because it's just when work ethic and these sorts of things clash with me. I struggle with it. And I blew right through Rosh Hashanah this year. I had a client that was just messaging me constantly during that 2-day period. And I didn't feel like I got the benefits of the practice from that period. So, turning over 1 year, trying to get that kind of optimistic headspace for the new year, and it really messed with me. And so I'm going to try to take the day one way or the other and kind of get back on the horse mentally, because it's just, we live in an age where people sadly do not understand the that for some people these sorts of marking time things are not fairy dust and I believe in some sort of spaghetti monster type of thing. They're exercises for people. They are times to get quiet and stillness and hit pause on your life and just get calm. And they're important. They're important in that regard. I'm trying to find a segue into Patreon, and this isn't it. So I'm gonna keep talking. And one of the things during this reflective period, because for people who don't know, it's like you have this, all this Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur to try to take stock of your life over the past year and fix whatever you gotta fix with people, or else it's like on your permanent record. And, these are the things that I'm kind of like, yeah, these things are important. These stops, because these mental and to some extent emotional check-in times, they're very important to keep you grounded in what's sort of fact and kind of what's important. And if those of you who are sort of religion averse are like, but, I'm telling you what this does for me. You may notice I am quite the pragmatist, and my sort of faith journey, philosophical journey was very winding. Growing up in staunchly religious American communities put me off it for a really long time. Seeing and rediscovering the importance of certain things as an adult, and actually getting in and doing some of the reading and seeing some of the common themes that various religions around the world have in common. I kind of found a way to do it my way. And I think that's the way to do it, is to get cheesy. And I did it my way. I sang. This is a point to go in. Patreon. You should become a member. Patreon.com/Leanna K. Okay, that wasn't such a horrible segue there. Okay. I hate mixing like religion and commerce. But that's kind of on point for this. I can talk about my philosophical beliefs another day. And if I were to say, are they religious beliefs or are they philosophical beliefs, I'd probably come down more on they are philosophical beliefs than some belief in some, all-seeing higher power. That just doesn't make sense to me. But this idea of certain things being sacred, this is where I start to have trouble, because my idea of sacred other people's idea of sacred are very, very different in that there is nothing in this world I believe should not be questioned. And that's a big difference between me and other people who practice the mantra, no one is immune from criticism. And while that's technically true, I don't think that's a good mindset to go into something with. Like, I'm going to criticize because I can. Nothing is immune from questioning, because anything worthwhile holds up under questioning. And so over the weekend, remember I said yesterday, there were things on the weekend that just were driving me nuts because of their sheer lack of rationality? Freaking Sesame Street became a culture war flashpoint. And I found myself going, is nothing sacred? And then I realized the very reason this has become a culture war flashpoint is because people have this nostalgic view of Sesame Street as something totally good and pure and nostalgic. And so unfortunately when things like that happen, when brands, when cultural things reach that status, all of a sudden people start seeing them as a bunch of things they are not. And the Marxists, and there's no other word for them based on the language that started getting dropped about things. The Marxists, the sort of economic left on the internet, went completely bonkers regarding Sesame Street. And the Verge apparently went full bonkers, saying a bunch of ridiculous, just factually inaccurate things, and a lot of what some people call bad takes. I hate that term. But before realizing they look like a bunch of idiots, and the Twitter feed started getting scrubbed. But it was trending, and I was like, what the heck? Because obviously, having worked in television and having been at television conferences, and there was one point I really wanted to do children's television. I ended up doing a very different kind of television, which completely precluded me from ever doing children's television. Because, people can't be multiple things. You can't play a part on one show and then do another kind of show, because some people, the line from reality and what's on TV blurs, and a lot of them are in television. But there seems to be this belief that because Sesame Street started on PBS, which is basically the forward-facing broadcast wing of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which was formed in the 1960s, I believe. But it was at the time when, it started national educational television, and then in late 1970 moved to the Public Broadcasting Service, or PBS. Now, full disclosure, my family loves PBS. My stepdad was a loyal member supporter of PBS for most of his life, because he loved his British shows that they played on it. So my family has a long history of support for public broadcasting. I really do think public broadcasting is important. The problem with the public broadcasting model right now is that the nature of television has changed radically, starting in the 1970s, but really accelerating in the 1990s with the explosion of cable television. And what's changed, and this is part of the reason I can pretty much cite, cultivation theory chapter and verse, is that television is now not a phenomenon where most of the households in America sit down and you have one of, at the time it was 3, now it's 4 plus cable main options. You had CBS, NBC, and ABC. Those were your choices. And so all of the TV watching North American world, because we get a lot of US shows up in Canada too, we're watching one of three shows at the exact same time, at the exact same, in the exact same way. It was this communal experience. I remember the old dial televisions, the old UHF dial televisions, and they only had 12 channels. 12. And then they moved to those little push button boxes that had maybe, 40 channels? And that was a big deal. The sound of the buttons pushing, I always loved it. Drove my grandparents crazy because you push button. You could tell I was a little nerd, right? Button, so cool. But from the 1970s, the late 1970s, 1978, 1978, that the 1970s were a period of real conflict between the Children's Television Workshop, which is the parent company of Sesame Street, and the Corporation of Public Broadcasting and its various funding models, grants. But the federal government was the one that was the big problem. The Department of Education was choking the Children's Television Workshop of funds. Now, keep in mind that this was the era of stagflation. The end of the 1970s were in a period of severe economic crisis. There were reasons for this, but it was a period of struggle. And at the end, in the late 70s, early 80s, the Children's Television Workshop, again, the parent company of Sesame Street, in fact, it's now called Sesame Workshop, decided to start doing toy licensing. That was when Children's Television Workshop began its slow and steady march towards not a publicly funded, feel good, everybody hug it out, think of the children thing. It became, having something of a merciless capitalist streak. Now, even going back, the ultimate goal of Sesame Street was never like it's PBS or nothing. All three major networks passed on Sesame Street when they were first pitching it. And I believe that ended up being referred to as a $1 billion blunder. So you can tell what the people who make these shows were thinking. This is about profit. All television at the end of the day is about profit. Even if something is on a public broadcaster, the people who make the show want to get paid. And what ended up happening after that, the 80s with the Big Bird toys and the Mr. Snuffleupagus and the Ernie and Bert and all that stuff, in the 1990s, television changed because the proliferation of cable happened. And suddenly, well, not suddenly, but by, in terms of eras, in terms of historical time periods, it was fairly rapid, the change. All of a sudden, there were these children's specialty networks that I won't get into the deregulation of television and the things that open this stuff up and the idea that, because there was a time that you couldn't run commercials during children's programming. That changed in the 80s. We wouldn't have He-Man if it wasn't about selling toys to kids through children's programming. But various passes of deregulation meant that those after school and Saturday morning blocks that were very tightly regulated fell away, and the era of the specialty children's channel was upon us. And what that meant is that you could plunk your little angel down, and up here I believe it was called Treehouse. There was Treehouse and YTV. In the US it was stuff like Nickelodeon, and you've got Disney Channel, but you could plunk your kid down in front of the TV and leave them there. You didn't have to worry about, that period ending. There wasn't an after school block. There wasn't a weekend block. It was kids shows all the time. And that really impacted Sesame Street's market. Sesame Street's ability to make money. It suffered a very large loss in ratings. And at the beginning of a slide, anyway. And so at that time, Sesame Street decided to take short ads. They accepted corporate money. This is in 1998. So all these Marxists out there who are spewing things like private capture of public goods. Yes, somebody actually said that to me. They actually said that Sesame Street moving to HBO Max was private capture of public goods. More on that in a bit. So as of the late 90s, they were accepting corporate ads. Now, this was for stuff like indoor playgrounds, right? But Ralph Nader went nuts saying running ads on Sesame Street was exploiting impressionable children. Ralph Nader was a little late to the party. Yeah, like I said, He-Man, that was like more than a decade earlier. Sorry, Ralph Nader, you're a little late. But that led to one of the big sort of what we would call a killer app in tech parlance, but the first killer app with children's merchandising, the Tickle Me Elmo. I believe Tickle Me Elmo was out in 1999, something like that. But it was this phenomenon. And I'm queuing this up here so that you guys can see now. Like, I just Googled Tickle Me Elmo on Amazon. I want you to see products. So much Elmo, so much Cookie Monster, an oddly naked Ernie. There's Oscar, so much Sesame Street merchandise. Why is Finding Nemo there? That's weird. But Tickle Me Elmo was this massive thing. Elmo was sort of the character that really made Sesame Street big corporate. And that was in the late 90s. And so then in 2015, in response to a new wave of funding challenges and in response to realities of the market changed again. Now we're no longer just having to worry about cable. We have all these premium cable and streaming services, watching TV on the computer, the U of tube, okay? All of a sudden, Children's Television Workshop had another audience and funding challenge. Kids just weren't watching TV anymore, even on cable. Why? Because this point-and-click model, the computer model, the streaming model, gave parents even more perceived control over what their little darlings that they're trying to indoctrinate to become carbon copies of their parents watched. This was ultimate power for parents. And so that's when Children's Television Network originally did the original deal with HBO, producing first-run episodes of Sesame Street. Again, Children's Television Network had been open to a for-profit broadcaster from the beginning. Just at that time, they rejected it. HBO saw value in this. And so now, the thing that there was a backlash then, and now there's another backlash now because it's moving to HBO Max, which is just the streaming version of HBO and a bunch of other I believe it's a bunch of Turner stations. It's like this omnibus thing. All I know is Doom Patrol's gonna be on it. That's where my point of reference is. But outraged, pearl clutching, think of the children literally ensued. And I think hopefully if you've been paying attention this far, you see how absolutely ridiculous this sudden freak out, especially among the left, that this is some symbol of corporate greed and everything's evil and nothing is good. And the claim that this favors privileged children over less advantaged children. And and then apparently the other thing is that the complaint is it's HBO, which it has adult dramas and comedies as well as Sesame Street. I hate to break it to these folks. If you saw the dramas, the British dramas that PBS is carrying all the time, it's pretty adult. I mean, it wasn't, PBS was never just a kids network. Now, it wasn't HBO, fine. I wonder how HBO Max is going to handle this. Are they going to have a kids stream? That I'm curious about, but that's up for them to work out, because Sesame Street is still going to be available 9 months later on PBS. That's always been part of the deal. It has been part of the deal as long as HBO has been involved. Interestingly, I believe it's only a 5-year development deal, so we're going to see what happens in 2020. I suspect that this move to HBO Max is going to be a big test. HBO may drop it after the end of this, and then we'll see what happens. That's going to be very interesting. But the other thing that's gone on with Sesame Street is it's been licensed to other countries. It's been formatted. We had little Canadian-specific segments in our version of Sesame Street. It was like a French-Canadian otter and a polar bear or something like that. No stereotype there. The people behind Sesame Street, this was not volunteer. This was always a money-making endeavor. That's not a bad thing. That's our world. And I'm getting a lot annoyed with this confusion between the real issues with kleptocracies or oligarchies or, neo-mercantilist economic structures, and this attack on capitalism that's going on as a knee-jerk to the left because Bernie Sanders made it trendy. If you actually read the stuff on economics, the model that we live in right now is not unchecked capitalism. It's not. There is no system in the world where there isn't some sort of government intervention in the markets. There has never been a period of unchecked capitalism in the history of the world. There has always been governments involved, deciding who was going to be the favored companies and who weren't. I mean, companies get preferential, like big companies get preferential tax rates. They get government grants. They get tax incentives. They get all this stuff that makes it harder for smaller businesses to compete. And so then the government goes, well, we're going to support small businesses. Well, that is government intervention in the markets. We are not living in an era of unchecked capitalism. But then those halcyon days of the 1960s and the 1970s, where people like to look back to and say, it was a better time, it was more idealistic. As you can see from this history of Sesame Street, the government was giveth and taking away even back then. They got all this feel-good stuff from starting up these networks, and then they gradually defund them. That's what always happens. There's a big problem up here in Canada where the funding models for content are so reliant on government startup money that you'll see a lot of shows show up, go for 2 years, and then disappear, because that's when their startup funding starts. And even with And that is only available to major broadcasters. The average person can't go in off the street and say, I want to make a show. Here's my plan. Give me money. That is still not enough of an incentive for anybody to even bother with First Window in Canada now. Everybody, First Window means air, first run. Everybody does deals with U.S. partners. The show's produced in Canada, but the U.S. broadcaster has the main ownership stake, and then Canada up here takes a piece or gets preferential pricing. That's how it works. And it's because of the same market forces that caused Sesame Street to go this way. Unfortunately, if you actually look at what's going on, if it weren't for the innovations in private industry, like HBO coming up with this novel idea, like whatever company developed those much better LED energy efficient light bulbs, we wouldn't be having the progress. We wouldn't be keeping a certain amount of freedom of thought and freedom of choice, because governments have been failing people for a really long time. And a big problem is gerrymandering. And this is when the claims of socialism, I'm a socialist, start to look a lot more like authoritarianism. The support for a model where the state gets to pick winners and losers. All moral hygiene is controlled by the government, and deviants are excommunicated. This is what the arguments regarding Sesame Street's change of business model really sounded like to me. And people like, no, it's think of the children, it's privilege, I didn't grow up in a privileged neighborhood. Sesame Street, I mean, God, especially living in the US, access to Sesame Street was dependent on access to a television. Having a television at all is a form of privilege. That's the absurdity of this argument. There are places in the world where people don't have TVs, and the whole laptop computer era completely jumped by them. Primary telecommunications is on cell phones. Like, this is a really privileged argument that television is somehow a public good. And people don't see their privilege. These educated to the point of indoctrinated Frankfurt School Marxists can't see their own privilege when they spew these absurd arguments. And this is why the whole check your privilege thing was, this mantra that you're supposed to be aware of your own privilege. And you'll notice I said I grew up in a very privileged, I grew up in not a privileged neighborhood, because it was majority Black. And I'm aware, I saw it even then. Like, this is why I feel so strongly about this stuff. Like, Black kids I grew up with used to tell me, don't screw around, you're smart, you can get out. And that you can get out, I didn't necessarily totally understand what they meant at the time. But part of it is I was a white kid, and I could go out and I could pass in society. They were always going to be Black. And, the idea was that you get out, you help your people. And the only way you do that is through capitalism. That was why when I finally did get a TV show, I started hiring women of color. We hired homeless people right off the street. We actually did, in a capitalist framework, things that were much more expedient and could impact individual lives right away, instead of the machinations of government taking a really long time to do the exact same thing. This is how the capitalist model is the only proven way that non-privileged communities gain privilege. It's the only way. If you have money, you can do things. If you don't have money, you are relatively voiceless. And I mean, ironically, one of the, biggest pre-Me Too unfair things that ever happened to somebody was what happened to Kevin Clash, the voice of Elmo. And there's theories about why that happened, having to do with him being black and him being gay. And I'm not going to get into that because I don't have the details on recall. But, just because something is a for-profit model does not make it evil. In a lot of ways, that belief is perpetuating these systems of power that these Marxists claim to oppose. But the truth is, why do we have powerful voices from racialized people today? Part of it is school busing. Part of it is education. But a big part of it is that guys like Jay-Z made a lot of money, bought sports teams, and now he's a mogul. The U.S. needed a critical mass of rich and middle class black people so they could start making media that became the culture. Things like Black Panther, things like Luke Cage, things like Empire. These do not happen because of government largesse. This happens because there's money to be made. And so this is why I get really, 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 really angry when Marxists, and I say Marxists as opposed to socialists for a very specific reason, because there's socialists up here in Canada that, they're NDPers. They're basically union guys, which is like workers' rights in a corporate framework. It's still private sector. They're not suggesting the government dole out luxuries and things like that. The government be in charge of everything. Because when they say the collective is in charge, no, that's absolutely not true. The collective's not in charge. The government becomes in charge under communist regimes. And I went to school with kids that got out of Russia. And when you hear those stories, there is no way you can get behind this stuff. There's naivety, and there's, quite frankly, a ton of arrogance going on with this stuff. And it's starting to get to the point, and this is all wrap here because I'm landing where I sort of landed last time too, is getting to the point where these Marxist thinkers just make up facts or eliminate facts because, the fact that very little changed, like nothing changed on the PBS side of the Sesame Street equation with this moves to HBO Max. All it did is it went from HBO itself to HBO streaming service. That's it. That's the only change. But that's inconvenient to this Marxist screaming point that, evil corporations are taking everything, think of the children, all that stuff. It's an inconvenient fact, so they just left it out. You can't do that. And why did I decide to do this video today? Because I am at the point where I know I take hits to my bottom line for comments like this. Because I could take a much easier path, leveraging my gender, saying the right things, and, just being professional, whatever, and having a much easier go of it. But I couldn't live with myself because that would be forsaking the people that told me you can get out when I was a teenager. And, I keep thinking back and I keep thinking they were telling me you could get out because they didn't think they could. And that's tied to race. That's tied to bigotry. That's tied to poverty as well. But these were smart kids telling me this. So it wasn't just smarts. It wasn't just smarts. It was this lack of hope. And I can't do that. I can't take the easy way out for myself and abandon people like that. You know, not necessarily those people, because they've done okay for themselves. The specific people that said that to me, they in some ways got out too. But it's this time of year where I'd have to do a lot more atoning if I took the easy way out then. Or it would be my permanent record because I didn't fix it in time till the book closed for the year. So that's why I'm talking about this now. And that's why I'm being so serious about it. Because I have that very direct human connection to these issues, I do come at it from a very different place than other people. And so I see the lack of authenticity in these other arguments. So that's where we'll leave it. Now I can plug the Patreon, no problem, because I just talked about, yay, capitalism, Patreon, you should become a member, Patreon. No video tomorrow because it's Yom Kippur. But I will be on Twitch at night. Okay? Okay. Thanks for watching, everybody.